Have you ever wondered how one reckless decision can change the course of a life forever? In the heart of New York City, where wealth and power rule, a single bet sets a chain of events into motion that no one could have anticipated. A cold, calculating millionaire finds himself trapped in a marriage he never wanted, tied to a woman whose strength will shatter his arrogance. But beneath the glittering facade of high society lies a web of secrets and lies, and the truth about a devastating accident will push them both to the brink. Stick around, subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're watching from, because this is only the beginning of a story that will leave you speechless. Ethan Gray adjusted his cufflinks, the polished silver gleaming under the dim light of the private club. The place reeked of old money, cigars, and the kind of arrogance only the obscenely wealthy could afford. Across the mahogany table, his friends were laughing, each man more entitled than the last. Ethan joined in, his deep laugh masking the growing boredom he felt. These nights, filled with expensive drinks and meaningless dares, had lost their charm. "All right, Ethan," said Alex, his oldest friend, slurring slightly from too much scotch. "You're always so sure of yourself. Let's see how far that confidence goes." Ethan smirked. "What's the bet this time, Alex? Another yacht race? A car you can't afford?" Alex leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with mischief. No, this one's different. I bet you can't commit to something real, something meaningful. You're all talk when it comes to taking responsibility." The group erupted into laughter. Ethan's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Name it," he said, leaning back in his chair, his tone dripping with mockery. Alex grinned. "You marry Charlotte Evans." The room went silent. "Who?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowing. "Charlotte," Alex repeated, his voice quieter now. "You know, the girl in the wheelchair. Her mom used to work for your family." The laughter in the room turned uneasy. Everyone knew Charlotte's story. She had been in a terrible car accident years ago, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. Her mother, who had been a housekeeper for the Gray family, struggled to make ends meet after her medical bills piled up. Charlotte had faded into the background of their lives, a reminder of a tragedy they all preferred to ignore. Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's not funny, Alex." "No," Alex replied, his tone sharper now. "It's a challenge. You always say you can handle anything. So prove it. Marry her. Give her a life she could never afford." For a moment, Ethan considered walking away. But then the room erupted in laughter again, and his pride got the better of him. He raised his glass. "Fine. I'll do it." Charlotte Evans sat by the window in her tiny Brooklyn apartment, watching the rain streak down the glass. Her world was quiet now, filled with the soft hum of her mother cooking in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. It was a far cry from the vibrant, active life she had once lived before the accident. She heard the knock at the door and turned her chair around, her heart sinking as her mother called out, "Charlotte, it's someone from the Gray family." Her hands tightened on the wheels of her chair as a tall man entered. His sharp suit and piercing blue eyes immediately put her on edge. "Charlotte Evans?" he asked, his voice smooth and practiced. "Yes," she replied, her tone cautious. "My name is Ethan Gray. Have a proposition for you." The words sounded absurd to her. Marriage? To Ethan Gray? She had barely interacted with him growing up. He was the son of the family her mother worked for, a figure who loomed large but distant. And now, out of nowhere, he wanted to marry her? "This is ridiculous," she said, wheeling herself back toward the window. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "Your mother is drowning in debt," Ethan interrupted coldly. "Medical bills, mortgage, everything. I can take care of all of that. All I ask is that you agree to marry me." Her mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Charlotte, maybe we should listen to him." Charlotte's chest tightened. The humiliation burned through her, but so did the desperate reality of their situation. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do you get out of it?" Ethan hesitated, his mask of confidence faltering for just a second. "That's not your concern," he said finally. She stared at him, searching for the real answer. But what choice did she have? If it meant giving her mother the stability she deserved, how could she say no? "Fine," Charlotte said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll marry you." The wedding was a rushed, joyless affair, held in the Gray family's estate on Long Island. Charlotte wore a simple white dress that she had altered herself, her wheelchair decorated with flowers by her mother. Ethan stood by her side, his face a mask of indifference. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan didn't even look at her as he said, "You're free to move into the mansion tomorrow." Charlotte clenched her hands in her lap, feeling the sting of his words. She had hoped, foolishly, that there might be some kindness in him. But it was clear now. This wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction. The Gray mansion was a cold, cavernous place, filled with reminders of a life Charlotte had once dreamed of but now dreaded. Ethan's mother, Veronica, was openly hostile, her sharp words cutting deep. "I can't believe you brought her into this house," Veronica hissed at Ethan one evening, loud enough for Charlotte to hear from the next room. "She'll ruin us. Mark my words." Charlotte gritted her teeth, refusing to let the tears fall. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Veronica wasn't just being cruel. There was something deeper behind her hatred, something Charlotte couldn't yet understand. And then, late one night, Charlotte overheard Ethan arguing with his uncle Richard in the study. "You've gone too far this time," Ethan said, his voice low and angry. "I won't let you ruin her life the way you've ruined everyone else's." Richard laughed coldly. "You don't have a choice, Ethan. You never did." Charlotte's blood ran cold. She didn't know what Richard was talking about, but one thing was clear. Whatever had brought her into this family wasn't just a simple bet. It was something much darker. The sound of the rain tapping against the windows of the Gray mansion seemed to echo Charlotte's unsettled thoughts. From the moment she arrived, the air had been thick with tension, and every room she entered felt colder than the last. Though she tried to steel herself, she couldn't ignore the accusatory stares from Ethan's mother, Veronica, or the whispering staff who scurried away whenever she wheeled into view. Her new life was supposed to bring relief to her family, but instead, it felt like she had traded one struggle for another. Late one evening, Charlotte sat alone in the dining room, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of her. Ethan was nowhere to be found. He had been scarce since their rushed wedding. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft click of heels on the marble floor. Veronica entered the room, her piercing gaze settling on Charlotte like a predator sizing up its prey. "You should eat," Veronica said curtly, her voice devoid of warmth. "You'll need your strength if you're going to endure this family." Charlotte looked up, her jaw tightening. "I'm not here to endure anything. I'm here because your son insisted on this arrangement." Veronica's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Oh, darling, don't delude yourself. Ethan doesn't care about you. He doesn't care about anyone but himself. This marriage is nothing more than a means to an end." "And what's that supposed to mean?" Charlotte demanded, her voice shaking but resolute. Veronica leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "It means you're a pawn in a game far bigger than you realize. And trust me, you won't win." Before Charlotte could respond, Veronica straightened and left the room, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. Charlotte's hands trembled as she clenched her fists, her mind racing with questions. The days that followed were no easier. Ethan returned home sporadically, each time more distant than the last. When he was around, he barely acknowledged her presence, retreating to his office or disappearing altogether. Charlotte, left to navigate the mansion alone, often found herself in the company of Mia, a young housekeeper with a warm smile and kind eyes. Mia quickly became Charlotte's only source of comfort in the cold, unwelcoming house. The two would sit together in the quiet corners of the mansion, sharing stories of their lives before fate had brought them to the Gray estate. "You're stronger than you think," Mia said one afternoon as she helped Charlotte wheel herself into the sunroom. "Most people would have broken under the weight of what you've been through. But you're still here. That says something." Charlotte gave her a weak smile. "Being here doesn't feel like strength. Feels like I'm just surviving." Mia hesitated, her expression darkening. "Be careful, Charlotte. This family, they have a way of breaking people. I've seen it happen before. What do you mean? Charlotte asked, her pulse quickening. Before Mia could answer, the door to the sunroom opened, and Ethan stepped in, his face a mask of irritation. Mia, I need a moment with my wife, he said, his tone clipped. Mia nodded quickly, giving Charlotte an apologetic look before slipping out of the room. Ethan crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite Charlotte, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, he said nothing, the silence between them growing heavier by the second. I know this isn't what you wanted, he said finally, his voice softer than she had expected. It's not what I wanted either. Charlotte straightened in her chair, meeting his gaze with defiance. Then why did you do it? Why force me into this? Ethan ran a hand through his hair, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade beginning to show. Because I didn't have a choice. Sometimes, life puts you in situations where every option is terrible, and you just have to pick the least awful one. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. That's not an answer. What's really going on here, Ethan? Before he could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. Richard entered the room without waiting for permission, his presence as unwelcome as ever. Am I interrupting? Richard asked, his tone laced with mockery. Yes, Ethan replied curtly, standing to face his uncle. Richard ignored him, turning his attention to Charlotte. Settling in nicely, I hope, he asked, his smile not reaching his eyes. Charlotte forced a polite nod. I'm managing. Well, that's good to hear, Richard said, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. This family has a way of testing people. I hope you're up to the challenge. Ethan stepped between them, his posture tense. What do you want, Richard? Richard's smile widened. Just checking in. After all, it's not every day my nephew brings home a bride. As Richard left, his laughter echoed down the hallway, leaving Charlotte with a sinking feeling in her stomach. That night, unable to sleep, Charlotte wandered through the darkened halls of the mansion. She found herself drawn to the study, a room she had been warned to avoid. Pushing open the heavy door, she stepped inside, her eyes immediately landing on a locked drawer in the massive desk. A sense of unease washed over her as she hesitated. But then she spotted a small key sitting on the desk, as if left there by mistake. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and slid it into the lock. The drawer clicked open, revealing a collection of old documents and photographs. Her breath caught as she pulled out a faded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Tragic accident leaves young woman paralyzed." The date matched the night of her crash. But as she read further, her heart stopped. The article mentioned a second car involved in the accident, a black SUV registered to the Gray family. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories and the cold, dismissive looks she had received from Veronica and Richard. This wasn't a coincidence. Couldn't be. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the study. Charlotte hastily shoved the papers back into the drawer and relocked it, her heart pounding in her chest. She wheeled herself out of the room just as the door opened, revealing Veronica standing in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" Veronica demanded, her eyes narrowing. "I couldn't sleep," Charlotte stammered, her voice unsteady. Veronica's gaze lingered on her for a moment before she stepped aside, her expression unreadable. "Go back to your room," she said coldly. As Charlotte made her way down the hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed a dangerous line. Whatever secrets the Gray family was hiding, they weren't going to let her uncover them without a fight. The rain poured relentlessly against the tall windows of the Gray mansion as Charlotte sat in her room, clutching the newspaper clipping she had taken from the study. Her mind spun with questions, each more troubling than the last. Why hadn't she known about the other car in the accident? And why was it connected to the Gray family? The muffled voices of Ethan and Richard arguing downstairs broke her train of thought. She wheeled herself to the door, cracked it open, and strained to listen. "I told you to leave her alone." Ethan's voice was sharp, edged with fury. Richard's response was calmer, but his words carried a sinister undertone. "You're forgetting your place, nephew. This isn't about you. It's about keeping this family intact." no matter what it costs. Charlotte's grip tightened on the armrests of her wheelchair. She knew Ethan was trying to protect her, but from what? And why did Richard seem so confident that she wouldn't be able to uncover the truth? The following morning, Charlotte found herself sitting in the kitchen with Mia, who was busy preparing breakfast. The warm, homey aroma of coffee and fresh toast filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that seemed to permeate the house. "Mia," Charlotte began hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" Mia paused, glancing over her shoulder with a cautious look. "Of course. Have you ever heard anything about an accident? One involving the Gray family?" Mia's hands stilled. Her face paled slightly, and she avoided Charlotte's gaze. "Why are you asking about that?" "I found something," Charlotte admitted, her voice quiet but firm. "Something that makes me think they might have been involved in the accident that put me in this chair." Mia turned to face her, her expression conflicted. "Charlotte, you don't understand how dangerous this family is. Asking questions like that. It's not safe. Not safe," Charlotte repeated, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Mia, I deserve to know the truth. If they had something to do with what happened to me, I can't just sit here and pretend it's okay." Mia hesitated for a long moment before finally whispering, "There's a man, someone who used to work for the family. He might know something, but..." She trailed off, fear flickering in her eyes. "But what?" Charlotte pressed. "He disappeared after the accident," Mia said, her voice barely audible. "No one's seen him since." That evening, as the mansion grew quiet, Charlotte decided to confront Ethan. She found him in his office, his shoulders hunched over a glass of bourbon as he stared at the fireplace. "Ethan, we need to talk," she said, wheeling herself into the room. He glanced up, his expression weary. "What now, Charlotte?" "I know about the other car in my accident," she said, watching his face closely. Ethan froze, the glass halfway to his lips. Slowly, he set it down and met her gaze. "Where did you hear about that?" "I found a newspaper clipping," she replied. "It said the car was registered to your family. Why haven't I heard about this before?" Ethan let out a heavy sigh and rubbed his temples. "It's complicated," he said finally. "There are things you don't understand." "Then explain it to me," Charlotte demanded, her voice trembling with emotion. "Because right now, it feels like everyone in this house is hiding something from me." For a moment, Ethan looked like he might tell her the truth, but then he shook his head. "You don't want to know, Charlotte. Trust me, it's better this way." Her heart sank at his words. "You're just like the rest of them," she said bitterly. "You'd rather protect your family's secrets than do what's right." Ethan didn't respond, and Charlotte turned her wheelchair sharply, leaving the room before the tears in her eyes could fall. Over the next few days, Charlotte threw herself into uncovering the truth. She spent hours in the library, combing through old records and news articles. The more she dug, the more she realized how deep the Gray family's influence ran. There were whispers of scandals, lawsuits that had mysteriously disappeared, and employees who had abruptly left the company under suspicious circumstances. But one name kept appearing in her research: Thomas Grayson, a former chauffeur who had worked for the family for decades. According to the records, he had left his job shortly after her accident. Mia's words echoed in her mind. Thomas had disappeared. Determined to find him, Charlotte began making calls, using what little information she had to track him down. Finally, she got a lead. Thomas was living in a small trailer park on the outskirts of Queens. That night, under the cover of darkness, Charlotte convinced Mia to help her leave the mansion. They drove to the address she had found, the hum of the engine the only sound in the stillness. When they arrived, Charlotte's heart pounded as she stared at the rundown trailer in front of her. Mia hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" Charlotte nodded. "I have to know." They approached the door, and Charlotte knocked firmly. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, the door creaked open, and an older man with tired eyes and a weathered face appeared. "Thomas Grayson?" Charlotte asked, her voice steady despite her nerves. He frowned, his gaze flicking between her and Mia. "Who's asking?" "My name is Charlotte Evans," she said. I was in an accident years ago, a car accident. I think you might know something about it. Thomas's expression darkened, and he began to close the door. I don't know anything. Leave me alone. Wait, Charlotte pleaded, holding out the newspaper clipping. Please, this was my life. I need to know the truth. Thomas paused, his eyes scanning the article. Slowly, he opened the door wider. You'd better come in, he muttered. Inside the cramped trailer, Thomas lit a cigarette with trembling hands. I never wanted to get involved in this again, he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. But I guess I owe you the truth. Charlotte leaned forward in her wheelchair, her pulse racing. The night of your accident, Thomas began, I was driving that SUV, but I wasn't supposed to be there. Richard, your husband's uncle, ordered me to follow someone. He didn't tell me why, just that it was important. Who were you following? Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas hesitated. Your father. Charlotte froze. My father? But my father was already dead. Thomas interrupted, shaking his head. That's what they wanted you to think. But he wasn't. He was a whistleblower, trying to expose something about the Gray family's business dealings. Richard couldn't risk it, so he sent me to take care of it. Charlotte's stomach churned. And the accident? Thomas looked away, his voice heavy with regret. It was an accident. Your car came out of nowhere. I tried to stop, but he trailed off, his voice cracking. Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes. The truth she had been searching for was worse than she could have imagined. As Mia drove her back to the mansion, Charlotte sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. She had uncovered the truth about her accident. But at what cost? When they arrived, Charlotte looked up at the looming mansion, her determination hardening. The Gray family had taken everything from her, and now it was her turn to take something back. The dawn broke with a pale light that barely reached the Gray mansion, as though even the sun was reluctant to touch the house's walls. Charlotte stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her tired eyes scanning the face of a woman she barely recognized. The truth about the accident and the Gray family's involvement had shattered something inside her, but it hadn't broken her. If anything, it had lit a fire within her, one that would not be extinguished. She wheeled herself to the window and stared out at the sprawling estate. They've taken enough from me, she whispered to herself. No more. The day unfolded as usual, with the quiet murmur of staff bustling around the mansion. Veronica passed Charlotte in the hallway, barely sparing her a glance, and Richard was already gone, likely off to orchestrate more of his schemes. Ethan was the only person Charlotte was truly waiting to see. She found him in the garden, sipping coffee and staring out over the manicured hedges. The sight of him, so calm and composed, sent a wave of anger surging through her. How could he act as though everything was normal when he knew the truth? We need to talk, she said, wheeling herself onto the cobblestone path. Ethan turned, his expression neutral. Charlotte, not now. Yes, now, she insisted. Her voice was steady, but the weight of her words betrayed her fury. I met Thomas Grayson. The color drained from Ethan's face. He set down his coffee cup, his jaw tightening. You had no right to. I had every right. Charlotte snapped, cutting him off. You've lied to me, Ethan. Your whole family has. And now I know the truth. Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low hiss. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. If Richard finds out. I don't care about Richard, Charlotte interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. I care about the fact that your family destroyed my life and never thought twice about it. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, his composure slipping. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, he said quietly. The accident, it was a mistake. Richard didn't mean for you to get hurt. And that makes it okay? Charlotte demanded. That makes everything fine? Ethan's silence was answer enough. Charlotte spent the rest of the day avoiding everyone. She retreated to her room, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. She wanted to expose the truth, to make the Gray family pay for what they had done. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how impossible that seemed. The Grays weren't just wealthy, They were powerful. Their influence stretched across New York City, from the boardrooms of Fortune 500 companies to the corridors of justice. A single misstep could ruin her before she even had a chance to fight back. As the hours passed, her frustration grew. She needed a plan, but every path seemed to lead to a dead end. That evening, Charlotte received an unexpected visitor. Mia knocked softly on her door before slipping inside, her expression nervous. "Charlotte," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you need to know." Charlotte turned her wheelchair toward her, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" "I overheard Mr. Richard talking on the phone," Mia said, wringing her hands. "He mentioned something about finishing what he started." Charlotte's blood ran cold. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Mia admitted, "but he sounded angry. And I think he's planning something involving you." Charlotte's grip tightened on the armrests of her chair. She wasn't surprised by Richard's hostility, but the idea that he might still see her as a threat sent a chill down her spine. "Thank you for telling me," Charlotte said. "But you need to be careful, Mia. If Richard finds out you're helping me." Mia nodded. "I know. But you've been kind to me, Charlotte. I won't let them hurt you." Later that night, Charlotte's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to sit by and wait for Richard to strike. If he wanted to silence her, he would have to fight for it. She wheeled herself to the study, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. She knew she was taking a risk, but she couldn't stop now. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the drawer where she had first found the newspaper clipping. This time, she was searching for something specific, evidence that would tie Richard directly to the accident. After several minutes of searching, she found it. A folder filled with invoices, emails, and handwritten notes. One of the emails was from Richard to an anonymous recipient, detailing plans to neutralize a threat on the night of her accident. The evidence was damning. Charlotte's heart raced as she clutched the folder to her chest. She had what she needed. Now she just had to figure out how to use it. The next morning, chaos erupted in the mansion. Richard stormed into the dining room, his face red with fury. "Where is she?" he bellowed, slamming his fist on the table. Charlotte wheeled into the room, her expression calm despite the storm brewing around her. "Looking for me?" she asked coolly. Richard's eyes narrowed. "You've been snooping where you don't belong, little girl. Is that what you call uncovering the truth?" Charlotte shot back. Ethan entered the room then, his expression torn between anger and fear. "What's going on?" "She's been digging into things that don't concern her," Richard growled. "And if you don't put a stop to it, Ethan, I will." Ethan turned to Charlotte, his voice strained. "What did you do?" "I found the proof," Charlotte said, holding up the folder. "Proof that Richard orchestrated the accident, and that your family has been covering it up ever since." The room fell silent. Richard lunged toward her, but Ethan stepped between them. "That's enough," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "This ends now, Richard." "Don't be a fool," Richard snarled. "If she goes public with this, she'll destroy everything we've built." "Maybe it deserves to be destroyed," Ethan said quietly. Charlotte watched in stunned silence as Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before: regret. "Do what you have to do," he said. "I won't stop you." But before Charlotte could respond, a loud explosion rocked the mansion. The windows shattered, and the air filled with smoke and chaos. Screams echoed through the halls as fire spread rapidly, consuming everything in its path. Charlotte's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. This wasn't an accident, it was sabotage. Richard's voice rang out over the chaos, filled with fury and desperation. "You think you can take me down? You have no idea what I'm capable of." Charlotte's heart pounded as she realized the truth. Richard would rather destroy everything than let her win. As the flames closed in, Charlotte knew this was only the beginning. The battle for justice had just turned deadly, and the stakes were higher than ever. The acrid smell of smoke filled Charlotte's lungs as the fire raged around her. The mansion, with all its grandeur and secrets, was turning into an inferno. She gripped the wheels of her chair, trying to push herself toward the nearest exit, but the flames closed in too fast. "Help!" she shouted, coughing as the heat stung her skin. Suddenly, Ethan appeared through the haze, his face smeared with soot, his shirt torn. "Charlotte," he yelled, rushing toward her. "I can't move fast enough," she cried, panic gripping her as the fire roared. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed her chair and began pushing her toward the main hall, his muscles straining against the weight and resistance. Around them, the ornate wood-paneled walls groaned and crackled, threatening to collapse. Behind them, Richard's furious voice echoed through the chaos. "You think you've won, Ethan? You're a fool. You'll lose everything." Ethan didn't stop. His focus was on Charlotte as they burst through the front doors, coughing and gasping for air. Outside, the mansion staff and Veronica stood in stunned silence, their faces pale as flames consumed the home. "Where's Richard?" Veronica demanded, her voice shrill. Charlotte turned to Ethan, her chest heaving. "He set this fire, didn't he?" Ethan nodded grimly. He'd rather destroy everything than let the truth come out. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and fallout. Firefighters worked tirelessly to extinguish the blaze, but the mansion was reduced to little more than ash and rubble. The once mighty gray estate was now a smoldering ruin. Charlotte found herself in a hospital room, recovering from minor burns and smoke inhalation. Mia sat by her side, her eyes filled with worry. "How are you feeling?" Mia asked, her voice soft. "I'm fine," Charlotte replied, though the weight of everything that had happened pressed heavily on her chest. "But this isn't over. Richard's still out there." Mia hesitated before speaking. "There's something you need to know. After the fire, I overheard Veronica talking to someone on the phone. She sounded panicked, like she was trying to protect Richard." Charlotte's stomach twisted. Of course she's protecting him. He's her brother. They'd do anything to keep their secrets buried. Meanwhile, Ethan was facing his own reckoning. With the mansion gone and Richard on the run, the Gray family's reputation was in shambles. The media had caught wind of the fire, and questions about the family's business dealings were beginning to surface. Ethan sat in a makeshift office in one of the family's smaller properties, sifting through stacks of documents. He was determined to uncover every lie, every crime Richard had committed, but the task felt insurmountable. A knock at the door broke his concentration. He looked up to see Charlotte, her expression determined despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "We need to talk," she said, wheeling herself into the room. Ethan gestured for her to sit, though his own posture was tense. "I didn't think you'd want to see me. Don't get me wrong," Charlotte said, her voice sharp. "I'm furious with you, but right now we have bigger problems." Ethan nodded slowly. "Richard." "He won't stop," Charlotte said. "As long as he's out there, he's a threat to both of us." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "I know. I've been trying to track him down, but he's always been good at covering his tracks." Charlotte studied him for a moment before speaking. "We need help. Someone who isn't tied to your family. Someone who can take Richard down without getting caught in his web." Ethan frowned. "You're talking about going public?" "Yes," Charlotte said firmly. "I have the evidence. I have the story. If we expose him, he won't have anywhere to hide." Ethan hesitated. "Do you have any idea what that would mean? For me? For my mother? For the family name?" Charlotte's eyes blazed. "Do you think I care about your family name? Your family ruined my life, Ethan. They left me in this chair. And now you're asking me to protect them." Ethan looked away, guilt etched on his face. "You're right," he admitted. "But if we do this, there's no going back. Richard won't just sit quietly while his empire crumbles." "Then we'll be ready for him," Charlotte said. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Charlotte worked tirelessly with a journalist she trusted, carefully laying out the story piece by piece. She provided the evidence she had gathered, from the email incriminating Richard to the testimonies of former employees who had been silenced over the years. Ethan, for his part, used his remaining influence to ensure their safety. He hired private security and worked behind the scenes to prepare for the inevitable backlash. But not everyone was supportive. Veronica confronted Ethan one evening, her anger palpable. "How could you betray your own family like this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with rage. "I'm not betraying anyone," Ethan replied. "I'm doing what's right." "What's right?" Veronica scoffed. "You're destroying everything your father built. Everything we've worked for." Ethan's expression hardened. "What we've worked for is built on lies. And I won't let it continue." The day the story broke, the world seemed to stand still. News outlets across the country picked up the exposé, detailing decades of corruption, cover-ups, and the truth about the accident that had left Charlotte paralyzed. The fallout was immediate. The Gray family's business empire began to collapse as investors pulled out and lawsuits flooded in. But the biggest blow came when Richard was finally located. Law enforcement raided a secluded property in upstate New York, where Richard had been hiding. He was arrested without incident, though his calm demeanor as he was led away in handcuffs sent a chill down Charlotte's spine. "This isn't over," he said to the cameras, a cold smile on his face. For Charlotte, the victory was bittersweet. She had exposed the truth and ensured that Richard would face justice. But the scars of what she had endured remained. As she sat in her apartment, now rebuilt and filled with warmth, she couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She wheeled over and opened it to find Ethan standing there, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Can I come in?" he asked. Charlotte hesitated before nodding. Ethan sat across from her, his expression earnest. "I know I can't undo what my family did to you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better, to make things right." Charlotte studied him for a long moment. "It's going to take more than words, Ethan." "I know," he said, "but I'm willing to spend the rest of my life proving it." The story wasn't over yet. Richard's trial loomed on the horizon, and the wounds he had inflicted on so many would take years to heal. But for the first time, Charlotte felt a glimmer of hope. She had fought back against the darkness, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew she wasn't alone. The courtroom buzzed with tension. The trial of Richard Gray was the kind of event that gripped the nation, drawing cameras, reporters, and a public eager for answers. For Charlotte, seated in the gallery alongside Mia and a handful of other victims willing to testify, the weight of the moment felt almost unbearable. Richard sat at the defense table, his composure unervingly calm. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, he exuded an air of untouchable confidence. His expensive suit was pristine, and the faint smirk on his lips seemed to suggest he believed the entire trial was a farce. "Do you think he'll get away with it?" Mia whispered to Charlotte, her voice tinged with both fear and anger. Charlotte's jaw tightened. Not this time. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution presented a damning case. Witness after witness testified to Richard's crimes. Employees he had silenced, business partners he had betrayed, and even former allies who had finally turned against him. But the most devastating testimony came from Charlotte herself. When she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She looked out at the sea of faces, her heart pounding. But when her eyes met Richard's, she felt her fear dissolve into resolve. "Can you describe what happened the night of your accident?" the prosecutor asked gently. Charlotte nodded, her voice steady. "I was driving home after visiting a friend. It was late, and the roads were dark. I remember seeing headlights behind me, bright, erratic. And then, I don't know what happened. I woke up in the hospital days later. They told me I'd never walk again." The prosecutor handed her a photograph, the same one Charlotte had found in the Gray Mansion's study. It showed the black SUV registered to the Gray family. This vehicle, the prosecutor said, was identified as the second car involved in the crash. "Can you tell the court what you've learned about its connection to the defendant?" Charlotte took a deep breath. It was being driven by Thomas Grayson, one of the Gray family's employees. "He told me he was ordered by Richard Gray to follow my father that night." The courtroom murmured as the prosecutor continued. "And why was your father being followed?" "Because he was trying to expose corruption within the Gray family's businesses," Charlotte said, her voice shaking slightly. "He was a whistleblower." Richard wanted to stop him, no matter the cost. Richard's attorney objected, but the judge overruled, allowing Charlotte to continue. "I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time," she said, her voice breaking. But Richard didn't care. After the accident, he covered it up. He made sure I never knew the truth about what happened or why. After her testimony, Charlotte felt both relief and exhaustion. She returned to her seat, where Mia gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Ethan sat a few rows behind them, his presence a silent but steady support. When it was Richard's turn to testify, the mood in the courtroom shifted. He took the stand with the same unshakable confidence he had carried throughout the trial. "The accusations against me are baseless," he said smoothly. "I have dedicated my life to building a successful business. It's not my fault that some people like Ms. Evans, are looking for someone to blame for their misfortunes." Charlotte's hands clenched into fists as she listened to his lies. But then the prosecutor presented the evidence Charlotte had uncovered. The email Richard had sent, detailing his orders to neutralize a threat. The courtroom erupted in whispers, and for the first time, Richard's composure faltered. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed around Charlotte. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and microphones were shoved in her direction. "Ms. Evans, how do you feel about the trial so far? Do you think Richard Gray will be convicted? What's next for you if he goes free?" Charlotte raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "I'm not here for revenge," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I'm here for justice, not just for me, but for everyone Richard has hurt. And I won't stop until we get it." That night, back in her apartment, Charlotte sat alone, replaying the events of the day in her mind. The trial had dredged up so many painful memories, but it had also brought her a step closer to closure. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Ethan standing there, holding a small bouquet of flowers. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone more curious than hostile. Ethan offered a tentative smile. "I wanted to check on you. Today was intense." Charlotte wheeled herself back, gesturing for him to come in. "You didn't have to do that. I'm fine." Ethan set the flowers on the table, his expression serious. "I know you don't trust me, Charlotte, and I don't blame you, but I want you to know that I'm on your side. Whatever happens, I'll be there." Charlotte studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity. But for once, Ethan's words seemed genuine. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but this fight isn't over yet." The next day, the trial took a dramatic turn. Richard's defense team attempted to discredit Charlotte's testimony, accusing her of seeking attention and financial gain. But the prosecution countered with one final witness, Thomas Grayson. When Thomas entered the courtroom, the tension was palpable. His testimony was raw and emotional as he recounted the events of the night of the accident. "I was following her father," Thomas admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "Richard told me to handle the situation. I didn't know what he meant at first, but when the crash happened, I knew I was part of something terrible." The courtroom fell silent as Thomas continued, his voice cracking. "I stayed quiet because I was afraid, but I can't carry this guilt anymore. Charlotte deserves to know the truth." As the trial drew to a close, the jury deliberated for hours. The wait was agonizing, each passing minute stretching Charlotte's nerves to their limit. Finally, the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and gasps. Richard was led away in handcuffs, his once confident demeanor shattered. For Charlotte, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars of Richard's actions would remain. Later that evening, Charlotte returned to her apartment, exhausted but relieved. As she sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, not entirely. There were still questions to answer, wounds to heal, and a life to rebuild. But for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. And she knew she wasn't alone in the journey ahead. The days after the trial were a blur of relief and uncertainty. Richard Gray was behind bars, but the ripple effects of his actions, and his downfall were just beginning to unfold. The once mighty Grey Empire was crumbling, and the family's name, synonymous with power and prestige, had become a target of scorn and ridicule. Charlotte sat in her apartment, staring at the folder of evidence she had fought so hard to bring to light. It was over, she reminded herself. The truth was out. Justice had been served. But deep down, she knew the wounds left behind by Richard's actions weren't so easily healed. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she was surprised to see Veronica standing there, dressed in an elegant coat but looking far less composed than usual. Her perfectly coiffed hair was slightly disheveled, and her eyes were red-rimmed. "May I come in?" Veronica asked, her tone subdued. Charlotte hesitated before nodding. She wheeled back to allow Veronica inside, unsure of what to expect. Veronica glanced around the modest apartment, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I suppose this is where you've been rebuilding your life," she said, her voice carrying a faint edge of condescension. "What do you want, Veronica?" Charlotte asked, cutting through the pretense. Veronica's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable. "I came to apologize," she said quietly. Charlotte blinked, stunned by the admission. "You? Apologizing?" Veronica sighed, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I know I haven't been kind to you, Charlotte. I've said things I'm not proud of. But I need you to understand. Everything I've done, every cruel word, every cold glance. It was because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Charlotte asked, her voice softening despite herself. "Afraid of losing everything," Veronica admitted. "My family, my reputation, the life I built with my husband. Richard always had control over us, in ways you can't imagine. He used fear like a weapon, and I let him." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't excuse what you did to me." "I know," Veronica said, her voice trembling, "and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I wanted to tell you, I admired your courage. You stood up to Richard in a way none of us ever could. And for that, you deserve more respect than I ever gave you." After Veronica left, Charlotte sat in silence, her mind racing. The apology, though unexpected, didn't erase the pain Veronica had caused, but it planted a seed of doubt. Was Veronica truly a victim of Richard's manipulation, or was she simply trying to salvage what was left of her reputation? Charlotte pushed the thought aside and turned her attention to more immediate concerns. The fallout from the trial had left her with a difficult decision to make. The media attention had brought offers of interviews, book deals, and speaking engagements. She could use her story to inspire others, to shed light on corruption and injustice. But stepping into the spotlight came with risks. Risks she wasn't sure she was ready to take. One evening, as she pondered her next steps, Ethan showed up at her door. He was carrying a box filled with old photographs and documents, his expression hesitant but determined. "I've been going through my father's things," he said, setting the box on her kitchen table. "There's something I think you should see." Charlotte rummaged through the box, her fingers brushing over faded photographs of the Grey family. She paused when she found a picture of a younger Richard standing next to a man she recognized instantly. Her father. "What is this?" she asked, holding up the photograph. "They were friends once," Ethan said, "before everything fell apart. My father told me Richard admired your dad, saw him as a mentor. But when your father turned against the family, Richard felt betrayed. That's when things got dark." Charlotte's chest tightened. "So this was personal," she said bitterly. "It wasn't just about business. He wanted revenge." Ethan nodded. "I think so, but there's something else you need to know." He pulled out a letter, yellowed with age, and handed it to her. "It's from your father," he said. "To my dad. I think it might give you some closure." Charlotte unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The words were faded but still legible, and as she read them, tears filled her eyes. In the letter, her father had written about his fears for the future, his regret for putting his family in danger, and his determination to expose the truth, no matter the cost. "He wanted to protect you," Ethan said softly. "He wanted a better world for you, even if it meant risking everything." That night, Charlotte couldn't sleep. The letter stirred a mix of emotions: grief for the father she had lost, anger at the injustice he had suffered, and a newfound sense of purpose. The next morning, she made her decision. She called the journalist who had helped with the trial and agreed to an interview. If her father had been willing to risk everything to expose the truth, she would honor his legacy by doing the same. The interview aired a week later, and it was nothing short of a revelation. Charlotte spoke candidly about her accident, her fight for justice, and the courage it took to stand up to one of the most powerful families in the country. She shared her father's story, painting a picture of a man who had fought for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against him. The response was overwhelming. Letters and messages poured in from people who had been inspired by her story. Some shared their own experiences with injustice, while others simply expressed their admiration for her bravery. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt a sense of hope. But not everyone was pleased with her newfound platform. Late one night, as Charlotte sat in her living room, a brick shattered her window. She wheeled herself to the broken glass, her heart pounding. Outside, she saw the faint outline of a figure disappearing into the shadows. The police arrived quickly, but there was little they could do. As she explained what had happened, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random act of vandalism. It was a warning. The fight wasn't over yet. The next morning, Ethan called her, his voice urgent. "We need to meet," he said. "I think I know who's behind the attack." Charlotte agreed, her mind racing as she prepared to leave. She didn't know what Ethan had discovered, but one thing was clear: the past wasn't done with her yet. The small cafe in Midtown Manhattan was bustling with the morning rush. Charlotte sat at a secluded corner table, the hum of conversation around her drowned out by the storm of thoughts in her mind. She hadn't seen Ethan since their emotional exchange over her father's letter, and the cryptic tone of his call had left her unsettled. When Ethan arrived, his face was drawn and serious, dark circles under his eyes betraying his exhaustion. He carried a folder tucked under his arm and slid into the seat across from her. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low. Charlotte tilted her head, studying him carefully. "What's going on, Ethan? You sounded urgent." He placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing a series of photographs and documents. The first image was of the shattered window at her apartment, taken after the recent attack. The next was a blurry surveillance photo of a man standing in the shadows outside her building. "That's him," Ethan said, pointing to the figure in the image. "Who is he?" Charlotte asked, her stomach tightening. "His name is Marcus Hall," Ethan explained. "He worked for my Uncle Richard for years. He was one of his enforcers. Someone Richard used to intimidate people who got in his way." Charlotte stared at the photo, her pulse quickening. "You think Richard sent him?" Ethan shook his head. "It's not that simple. Marcus disappeared after the trial, just like Richard's other loyalists. But I've been digging into his connections, and it looks like someone else has taken up where Richard left off." "Who?" Charlotte demanded. Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Veronica." Charlotte's breath caught. "Your mother? But she apologized to me. She said she admired what I did." "That might be true," Ethan admitted. "But she's desperate to salvage what's left of the family. I think she's pulling strings behind the scenes to silence anyone who could drag our name further into the mud." Charlotte sat back, her mind racing. If Veronica was behind the attack, it meant her battle with the Gray family wasn't over. It had only shifted to a more insidious front. "What do we do now?" she asked finally. Ethan leaned forward, his voice firm. "We expose her, just like we did with Richard. But this time we have to be careful. My mother knows how to manipulate people. If we make one wrong move, she'll turn this around and make it look like you're the villain." Charlotte nodded, determination hardening her features. "Then we'll have to be smarter than her." Over the next few days, Ethan and Charlotte worked tirelessly to uncover Veronica's schemes. Ethan used his connections to access financial records and private communications, while Charlotte reached out to Mia and other former employees who might have valuable information. One evening, Ethan called Charlotte with a breakthrough. "I found something," he said. "Meet me at the old Gray estate. It's important, The Gray estate had been abandoned since the fire, its once grand halls now reduced to charred ruins. As Charlotte arrived, she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that hung in the air. She wheeled herself across the cracked stone pathway, the sound of her wheels echoing in the empty space. "Ethan," she called, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm here," he replied, stepping out of the shadows. He was holding a thick envelope, his expression grim. "What is it?" Charlotte asked. Ethan handed her the envelope. Inside, she found copies of financial transfers, emails, and handwritten notes, all tied to Veronica. "These documents show that my mother has been funneling money to Marcus and others like him," Ethan explained. "She's been using them to threaten anyone who might damage the family's reputation further, including you." Charlotte's hands trembled as she examined the evidence. "This is enough to bring her down," she said. Ethan nodded. "It is, but it won't be easy. If we go public with this, she'll fight back with everything she has. She won't just go after you. She'll come after me, too." Charlotte met his gaze, her eyes filled with resolve. "Then we fight. Together." The decision to confront Veronica wasn't one Charlotte took lightly. She knew the risks, but she also knew that staying silent would only embolden her enemies. Ethan arranged a meeting with his mother at a neutral location, a high-rise office building in downtown Manhattan. The room was stark and impersonal, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of the city. When Veronica arrived, she was impeccably dressed, her posture rigid, her expression cold. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone clipped. Ethan stepped forward, holding up the envelope of evidence. "This is about the truth, Mother. About what you've been doing behind the scenes." Veronica's eyes narrowed as she glanced at the documents. "And where did you get those?" she asked, her voice icy. "That doesn't matter," Ethan replied. "What matters is that we know what you've been doing. Paying off enforcers, threatening whistleblowers. It's all here." Veronica's lips curled into a faint smile. "Do you really think you can use this against me? I'm your mother, Ethan. Everything I've done has been to protect this family." "Protecting the family?" Charlotte interjected, her voice trembling with anger. "You call destroying lives and silencing victims protection? You're no better than Richard." Veronica turned to Charlotte, her gaze sharp. "You don't understand what it means to carry the weight of a legacy. You've never had to make the hard choices." "You're right," Charlotte said. "I've never had to choose between power and decency. But if I did, I'd choose decency every time." Veronica's expression hardened. "You think you've won, don't you? That exposing me will make everything right. But you don't realize what you're up against." Ethan stepped between them, his voice firm. "We're not afraid of you anymore, Mother. This ends now." The fallout was swift. Charlotte and Ethan took the evidence to the authorities and the press, ensuring that Veronica's actions would be brought to light. The public backlash was immediate, and Veronica's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. In the weeks that followed, the Gray family's remaining influence dissolved. Veronica retreated from the public eye, her reputation in tatters. Marcus was arrested, along with several others involved in the scheme, and for the first time, Charlotte felt a sense of justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been harmed by the Grays. One evening, Charlotte sat on the balcony of her apartment, gazing out at the city skyline. Ethan joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "It's over," he said, handing her a cup. Charlotte nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "For now," Ethan chuckled. "You're not going to let me forget that, are you?" "No," Charlotte replied, "because we both know the fight never really ends. But at least this time we're ready for it." As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, Charlotte allowed herself a moment of peace. The battle had been hard-fought, and the scars it left would take time to heal. But for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for: freedom. The quiet that settled over Charlotte's apartment was deceptive. From the outside, it seemed as though the storm had passed. Richard was in prison, Veronica's schemes were exposed, and the Gray family's empire lay in ruins. But in her heart, Charlotte knew this wasn't the end. There was still unfinished business. questions lingering in the shadows, truths that hadn't yet come to light. That unease only deepened when she received a package at her door one morning. It was an unmarked envelope, thick and heavy, with no return address. Charlotte hesitated for a moment before opening it, her hands trembling. Inside, she found a single photograph and a short note. The photograph showed a young woman with piercing blue eyes and a faint smile. She was standing next to Richard in what looked like a private office. The note, written in jagged handwriting, read, "Ask Ethan about her." Charlotte stared at the photograph, her mind racing. Who was this woman, and why did the sender want her to confront Ethan about her? Later that evening, Ethan arrived at Charlotte's apartment for their usual strategy meeting. They had been working together for weeks to rebuild what the Gray family had destroyed, helping victims, speaking out against corruption, and supporting each other through the fallout of the trial. But tonight, something felt different. Charlotte slid the photograph across the table. "Who is she?" Ethan's face went pale. He picked up the photo and stared at it, his hand tightening around the edges. "Where did you get this?" "It was left at my door this morning," Charlotte replied, watching his reaction closely. "The note said to ask you about her." Ethan set the photo down, his jaw tightening. "Her name is Claire Harper. She worked for the family years ago, and," Charlotte pressed, "what does she have to do with all of this?" Ethan hesitated, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of the truth was too heavy to bear. Claire was an accountant. She uncovered discrepancies in the company's finances, embezzlement, money laundering, things Richard was orchestrating behind the scenes. She threatened to go public, but he trailed off, unable to finish. "But what, Ethan?" Charlotte demanded. "She disappeared," Ethan said finally. "No one ever saw her again. Richard told us she had taken a settlement and left the country, but I never believed him. I think he had her killed." Charlotte's stomach churned. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" "Because I was afraid," Ethan admitted, his voice raw. "Afraid of what I'd find if I dug too deep. Afraid of what it would mean for my family. But now, I realize keeping quiet only made things worse." The revelation about Claire haunted Charlotte. If Richard was responsible for her disappearance, it meant his crimes were even more heinous than she had imagined. And if someone was sending her this photograph now, it meant there were still people out there who wanted the truth to come to light. Determined to uncover what had happened to Claire, Charlotte reached out to the journalist who had helped expose Richard. Together, they began piecing together Claire's story, following a trail of financial records, employee testimonies, and hidden correspondence. What they found was chilling. Claire had uncovered a massive fraud scheme that implicated not only Richard but also Veronica and several other high-ranking members of the Gray family's business empire. The records showed that Claire had attempted to report her findings to law enforcement, but before she could, she had vanished without a trace. As the investigation deepened, the danger became impossible to ignore. Charlotte started receiving threatening phone calls in the middle of the night, her silence on the other end of the line punctuated only by the faint sound of breathing. Her apartment was broken into while she was out, the intruder leaving nothing behind but an overturned chair and a sense of foreboding. Ethan, too, found himself under scrutiny. His bank accounts were frozen without explanation, and a smear campaign emerged in the media, painting him as a disgraced heir trying to exploit his family's downfall for personal gain. "It's Veronica," Ethan said one night, pacing Charlotte's living room. "She's still pulling strings, trying to scare us into silence." "She's running out of time," Charlotte replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We're getting closer to the truth, and she knows it." Their breakthrough came when Mia called Charlotte with urgent news. "I found something," Mia said, her voice trembling with both excitement and fear. "An old file from the mansion, hidden in the servants' quarters. It's got Claire's name all over it." The file contained handwritten notes, emails, and a list of names, all connected to Claire's investigation. But the most shocking document was a letter Claire had written to Richard, begging for her life. "I know what I found," the letter read, "but I don't want to destroy you. I just want to walk away. Please let me go." Charlotte's hands shook as she read the letter aloud to Ethan. She knew she was in danger, she said. She tried to reason with him, and he killed her anyway. Ethan's expression darkened. This is enough to take Veronica down, he said. She was complicit in everything Richard did. She knew, and she helped cover it up. The confrontation with Veronica was inevitable. Ethan arranged to meet her at her penthouse, a fortress of luxury that felt miles away from the ruins of the Grey Mansion. Charlotte insisted on coming along, despite Ethan's protests. I'm not sitting this one out, she said firmly. Not after everything she's done. When they arrived, Veronica greeted them with icy disdain. I assume you're here to gloat, she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. No, Ethan replied, his voice calm but resolute. We're here to end this. He placed the file on the table, watching as Veronica's expression flickered between anger and fear. This is everything, he said. Proof of what you and Richard did to Claire. Proof that you covered it up. It's over, Mother. Veronica's hands trembled as she picked up the file. You don't know what you're doing, she said, her voice cracking. If you go public with this, you'll destroy what little is left of this family. There's nothing left to destroy, Charlotte said coldly. Your family destroyed itself long ago. Veronica's downfall was swift. The evidence against her was undeniable, and within weeks, she was facing charges of conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. For Charlotte, the victory felt hollow. Another chapter of pain in a story that seemed endless. But as she sat in her apartment that night, staring out at the city lights, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had fought for justice, not just for herself but for Claire and every other victim of the Grey family's greed. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Charlotte felt like she was winning. The courtroom was silent as the judge read Veronica's sentence. 20 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. For Charlotte, the moment was bittersweet. She watched as Veronica, once the picture of composure and authority, was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs. There was no triumphant smirk on Veronica's face, no parting shot to remind everyone of her power. Instead, there was only resignation, her head bowed as she disappeared from sight. Justice had been served, but the scars of the battle were still fresh. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte worked tirelessly to help those whose lives had been ruined by the Grey family's corruption. Her newfound platform brought her opportunities she had never imagined. Speaking engagements, interviews, and collaborations with advocacy groups. Yet, amidst the recognition and gratitude, there was an ache in her chest that wouldn't fade. One evening, as she sat in her apartment with Mia, Charlotte let out a heavy sigh. You've done so much good, Charlotte, Mia said, pouring her a cup of tea. You should be proud of yourself. I am, Charlotte replied, her voice tinged with sadness. But it doesn't change the fact that so much was lost. My father, Claire, the years I spent searching for answers, none of that can be undone. Mia placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Maybe not, she said gently, but you've given their stories meaning. You've made sure they weren't forgotten. Charlotte nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I just wish my father could see this. He gave everything to do what was right, and he never got to see the difference he made. One afternoon, Ethan showed up at Charlotte's apartment unannounced, carrying a small leather-bound journal. He looked different, lighter, freer, as though the weight of his family's sins had finally been lifted from his shoulders. What's that? Charlotte asked, gesturing to the journal. It's something I found while going through my father's old belongings, Ethan said, sitting across from her. It belonged to your dad. Charlotte's breath caught as she reached for the journal. The leather was worn, the pages filled with her father's neat handwriting. I thought you'd want to have it, Ethan said quietly. Charlotte opened the journal, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. It was filled with her father's thoughts, his dreams for the future, and his love for his family. One entry stood out. No matter what happens, I want Charlotte to know that she is my greatest achievement. She has the strength to change the world, and I have no doubt she will. Tears streamed down Charlotte's face as she read the words. Thank you, she whispered, clutching the journal to her chest. Over the next few months, Charlotte and Ethan began rebuilding their lives. The Gray family's once mighty empire had crumbled, but in its place, they found a sense of purpose and clarity. Ethan used his remaining resources to support the victims of his family's crimes, while Charlotte continued to advocate for justice and transparency in business and government. Their relationship, once defined by distrust and resentment, began to evolve. They spent more time together, working on shared projects and learning to trust each other in ways they never had before. One evening, as they sat on a park bench overlooking the city, Ethan turned to Charlotte with a hesitant smile. He said, "I used to think this life, the money, the power, was all that mattered. But now I realize it was never about any of that." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "What was it about, then?" Ethan's smile softened. "It's about people, about doing the right thing even when it's hard. And I learned that from you." Charlotte looked away, her heart pounding. "I'm not sure I'm the best example," she said. "I've made plenty of mistakes along the way." "We all have," Ethan replied. "But the difference is you never stop trying to make things better. That's what makes you incredible." As the sun set over the city, Charlotte allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. The journey she had been on was long and painful, but it had brought her to a place she never thought she'd reach. A place of peace, purpose, and possibility. She still carried the scars of her past, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they served as a reminder of her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering commitment to justice. Months later, Charlotte stood at a podium in a crowded auditorium, addressing an audience of hundreds. She spoke about her journey, about the power of truth and the importance of standing up against injustice. As she looked out at the faces in the crowd, some tearful, others filled with admiration, she felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. "I used to think I was just a victim," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But now I know that I'm so much more than that. I'm a survivor, and so are all of you." The room erupted in applause, and Charlotte smiled, feeling the weight of her past finally begin to lift. Later that night, as she sat in her apartment, flipping through her father's journal, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, and she knew, without a doubt, that her story was just beginning.